All right, we're here after the sermon, and we had a sermon on Colossians 1:15 through 20 this past Sunday, and really was an introduction to what Paul is saying in that text about Jesus and his person and his work. And Colossians 1:15 through 20 has to do with Christ being everything in the Christian life. So had a couple of follow-up questions from really what was an introduction to that text. So
one thing you said, I mean, it was in the middle of it, so your own heart for us, for the church, is that we would be obsessed, we'd be consumed with Jesus, in the context of his glory, his greatness. But practically, I don't always know what it means to be consumed or obsessed. What does that look like? Given my church background or various people's experiences, there might be some really concrete ideas of what that looks like, and those might not be the most helpful or only ways to think about that. So
let's talk about what it doesn't mean.
Okay.
It doesn't mean that you're weird.
Okay.
It doesn't mean you do weird things, strange things. It doesn't mean you stand out necessarily with billboards all the time, and you have those, and people do that, and that's okay. Everybody has their mission. But what it does mean is that your life is focused upon Christ. Everything that you do comes from Christ. Martin Lloyd-Jones said this years ago in a sermon. He said the difference between a Christian and a religious person is very obvious. He said for a religious person, Jesus is just something that you add to your life. You already have this full life that you're living. It's great. It's wonderful. And so religion is just something you do. But for a Christian, everything you do centers around Christ. And so you make decisions about what you're going to do for a living and how you're going to spend your time and what you're going to look at and what you're going to read and how you're going to interact with your family, how you're going to interact with your neighbors. All of those things comes from really what is a Christ-centered life. And that's what that means. What am I doing for Christ? One of the things I've been kind of researching this week and looking at is I heard years ago this study, and I can't find the study to save my life, so it's not going to make it into the sermon, so it might as well be said here. 90-year-olds were interviewed about what were the greatest regrets in their life. And so what would they do differently? And the one that stuck out to me that I remember the most is that they would invest in something that would outlive them. So if you think about that just for a minute, a 90-year-old or 90-plus-year-old saying that kind of thing, I'm going to invest in something that's going to outlive me, it's going to live on past me, is an interesting statement. A Christ-centered life, a heart that is focused upon Christ and loves Christ and is centered upon him, will leave a legacy that will far outlive anything else that we do. We could become wealthy, we could become famous, we can do all of those things. But yet, that Christ-centered life, that Christ-focused life, is going to make an impact on generations to follow, whether that's your children, your grandchildren, people in the church, people in your community, all of that. So it's going to change everything about what you do. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that you're weird, but everything you do is going to come from that center point of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And so if that's true of you, and you have this real focus on Christ, this real love for Christ, then you're going to want everybody else to know that too. And so you're going to talk to people about that. He's going to become topic of your conversation. He's the most important person in your life. We always use this illustration. You fall in love, and all of a sudden this person that you fall in love with is just everything to you, and you talk about her all the time. And but Jesus becomes that in your life. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. So just kind of so what you're saying with that is that what that looks like for a person in terms of practices and practical things, it might look different for a single high school teenage boy than it would for maybe a widow, or a single mother versus empty nesters. It can look different, right? One thing that you said that would be consistent would be Christ being the center. An expression of that would be maybe evangelism and sharing. Would there be any other kind of like practical things, regardless of someone's station in life, that you would say kind of go along with that consumed in obsession with Jesus?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Martin Lloyd-Jones says.
Okay.
Everything that we do
Okay.
springs from that relationship with Christ, that love for Christ. Okay. So we ask those questions in our own mind. Is this going to glorify Christ or not? And so whether you're a teenager in the youth group and you're worried about dating or what career you're going to have or whatever else you're going to be worried about, you're going to ask that question first. And whether you're a widow or a widower in your 90s, you're going to ask the same type of questions in your particular life station.
That makes sense. Cool. Another thing that came up in the message was, well, we talked a lot about in the message about a couple things. One, the glory of Christ, the person of Christ. Yeah. You talked a little bit about how there are those who would pervert Christ, his work, and his person for their own ends. Yep. So we talked a lot about reading this passage doxologically, just in worship, right? Yep. But can you just talk a bit more maybe why this is an important passage to study, to know doctrinally, theologically, just kind of...
Yeah, one of the things that I said in the sermon is that there's a possibility that it was an ancient hymn that Paul kind of put right into that text. And when we talk about a hymn, we're not thinking of a hymn like you and I would sing on Sunday morning, like the church would sing, where you've got meter and verse and you've got refrain. But rather, this was more of a confession of faith. This would be something, we have no idea how they sung in the first century church. We just know that they sung. The reason for that is nobody wrote down music notes and how to sing those things until many, many years later, probably about 1,400 years later. So we don't have any idea how they would have sung that, but they would have. They would have maybe chanted that. They would have done it in some fashion that has to do with the culture. But that hymn part of it was a confession of who Christ is and what he did. And so that tells us what the early church believed, what we're to believe, and what we're to proclaim about Jesus. So when you have, that's the doxological part of it. When you do the theological study of it, the academic study, the apologetic study, what you find out pretty quickly is that cults, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, you just go down the list, those that claim to be followers of Christ and yet they change things about what Christ did, will often take that very text and twist it. And they make it say something that it doesn't say. For instance, the firstborn of creation. And so we'll use this as an example. Well, it says there he's the firstborn of all creation. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that he was created, because it can't, because the very next verse says all things were created through him. Okay, so if that were true, if he were a created being, then he would have had to create himself, which we know that's an impossibility. So those are the kind of things that we need to study when we're talking about this. And I don't want to go too much into it because I don't want to preach my sermon that I'm going to have on Sunday either. So it's very important that we understand what this text says, because it's quite possible that someone will show up at your door at some point and say, Jesus is not God. Jesus is a man, an angel, and only that. He is not God in the flesh. So that is one of the truths of this text, that this text teaches, that Jesus is creator and redeemer at the same time. And so he is fully or truly God, truly man at the same time as well. So that's one of those that we get our creeds from, our confessions from an original confession. So it's probably enough for today. And so we'll look for the discussion at the table this evening. Look forward to being a part of that. God bless you.